reported in Human Rights Watch in the year following sanctions, Putin denounced any government policies and administrators, granted extended prison sentences for rioting, fined people for being gay, and closed down nearly every non-governmental news source. As deputy director of the Human Rights Watch put in 2015, Putin has taken authoritarianism to a whole new level. The impact is twofold. First, human rights abroad are a massive Western interest. Clancy Wright from the University of Melbourne writes that Western cultural construct of human rights provides inherent and inalienable rights to all. This interest has been codified in law as the Council of Foreign Relations explains major regional organizations in the Western Hemisphere have integrated human rights into their mandate. Second, Timothy Peterson's Oklahoma University finds in 2011 that when states abuse more human rights, they are 279% more likely to initiate conflict against countries with regard for human rights. Contention 2 is poking the bear. Putin's Russia becomes more aggressive for two reasons. First is authoritarian consolidation. Catherine Hill of the Financial Times wrote in September of 2014 that Putin's previous attempts to militarize were held back by economic advisors in his inner circle. However, as sanctions have limited finances of those advisors, many of them have been pushed out. Sergei Markov, a former advisor to Putin, stated in 2015 that once the oligarchs fell, more aggressive and anti-Western advisors into the Siloviki stepped into Putin's inner circle. Andriy Ivanov of the Cato Institute in 2009 explained historically that the Siloviki use aggressive propaganda, economic extortion, intelligence operations, and military force against neighboring countries to take aggression behind the scenes. The threat of the Siloviki has never been more imminent. Ricardo Alfaro, the IAI, writes in 2015 that specifically because of sanctions, the Siloviki have been strengthened more than ever before. Second, aggression increases as Putin is backed into a corner. Richard Conley of the EU Institute for Security Studies explained in 2015 that sanctions have provided an alibi for Putin's economic failures. Without sanctions, his regime would have been much more accountable for its failed economic policies. Yet with sanctions, Putin has been able to assign any blame for economic hardship onto the West. Max Fisher of Vox News explains in 2014, due to the economic problems in Russia, Putin can't de-escalate tensions in Ukraine and more broadly in Europe because those tensions are just about all he has left. The worse Russia's economy gets, the more that Putin will have to justify exacerbating tensions with the West in order to justify blaming it all on the foreign complex. The increased threat has already materialized in two ways. First is by undermining democracy. Christopher Walker of World Affairs wrote in 2015 that Moscow's attack on Ukraine is not principally military anymore, but now also maintains its leverage through supporting insurgents that harm reform in Ukraine. Moreover, the Kremlin has targeted the democracies of the Baltic states through political and economic threats. Second is through increased military aggression. Igor Kozak of the Atlantic Council finds in 2015 that fighting is escalating in eastern Ukraine with more heavy weapons being used in order to sabotage the Minsk II ceasefire agreement. More importantly, he finds that Putin has taken action behind the scenes. Russian special services are intensifying their activities in peaceful cities, trying to destabilize the situation to show that Ukrainian authorities are not able to protect their citizens. Ultimately, Kozak concludes that the Kremlin's continued political and economic coercion could push Ukraine to be potentially a failed state in time, which is exactly what Moscow wants. The free world, in turn, cannot afford a failed state in the heart of Europe. Alexander Bosel of Foreign Affairs explains in 2015 the incredible Western interest of Ukraine. He explains that Putin's war against Ukraine is a war against Europe. Ukraine's geopolitical position has made it into a critical component of the West's defense against Russia. He furthers, Putin's aggression in Ukraine challenges the entire post-war security architecture as well as the relevance of its institutions, including the NATO and the EU. Because a fall in Ukraine means an endangered West, and sanctions only promote that. Amar and I have got to make it. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Alright, let's begin. L and I affirm. Contention 1, de-escalation. Subpoint A, military might. Reid Standish at the University of Glasgow reports that most Russian military facilities are outdated, which limits the threat Russia poses. Without Western military technology trade, Standish concludes that the Russian defense industry is unable to build advanced weaponry. Sanctions halt Russian military modernization for two reasons. First, sanctions slash Russia's military budget. Franz Stefan Gatti of The Diplomat reports that 2016 will be the first year since 2011 that the military budget will not increase dramatically, with a slated 0.8% increase in military spending, down from 25% in 2015. Matthew Bodder of the Moscow Times impacts that this will mean a $775 million cut in military infrastructure on the ground. Second, sanctions stop the trade of military technology. Per Olsen of the Swedish Defense Research Agency quantifies that as much as 90% of electronic components in Russian weapons come from the West, which stops the tech trade when you affirm. Subpoint B, changing the calculus. Sanctions influence Putin's decision-making for three reasons. First, internal strife becomes a pressing issue. Simone de Galbert of the Center for Strategic and International Studies reports that because of sanctions, Russia's GDP has fallen by more than 1%, contributing to the recession. The Stratfor Center furthers that economic hardships are affecting Russia's citizens, with the number of Russians living below the poverty line rising by 14% in the past year. Increasingly concerned with regional protests, the government is focusing more of its efforts on keeping its country stable, which limits its movement abroad. Second, sanctions impose consequences. Ian Bond of the Center for European Reform establishes that if the West allowed Russian aggression to go unpunished, other nations wouldn't trust the West to respond the next time Russia encroached on a nation's sovereignty. Iona Petrescu of the University of Maryland confirms that sanctions decrease the probability of further military dispute by 8%. Clifton Morgan of Rice University finds that when costs are severe, sanctions are effective at changing the target state's policies 94% of the time. Third, sanctions act as a uniting force. Daniel Kramer of the World Affairs Journal underscores that sanctions demonstrate that Putin's attempts to sow divisions among European nations have failed, and that Putin instead faces a now united West. The impact on Russian action is very clear. Adriel Kasanta of the Bow Group argues that sanctions have made Russia factor in a powerful Western response, and has deterred it from seizing more territory, like the coastal city of Mariupol or land bridge between Russia and the Crimea. Broadly speaking, Sergei Buyov of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace corroborates that in April 2014, Putin openly spoke of expansionism into southeastern Ukraine. However, John Herbst of the Atlantic Council contextualizes the change, that Russian bombings in Ukraine have dropped since September, while local elections have begun to take place. Contention 2, energy politics. Sanctions decrease European dependency on Russian energy for two reasons. First, growing European demand and decreasing Russian supply. Indira Oberlin of the Oil and Gas Journal writes that sanctions have enormous implication for future oil development projects in Russia, which could lead to a decreased output of 7% by 2025. The Congressional Research Service notes that Europe has a burgeoning demand for natural gas even as its domestic production decreases, so its foreign dependence is projected to grow. That foreign dependence won't go to Russia. Second, rising tensions. Bob Saber of the Atlantic Council continues that rising tensions between Europe and Russia further intensifies its European efforts to diversify its energy imports from non-Russian sources, impacting Russian market share in Europe. The impact is twofold. First, conflict decreases. Cullen Hendricks of the Peterson Institute for International Economics details that oil exporters are more likely to engage in interstate disputes because they hold the upper hand due to oil's importance. Driving Russia away from the resource that emboldened its foreign policy so gradually can prevent future conflict with the EU. Second, sanctions unite European energy markets. Hendricks continues that Russia used oil-backed coercive diplomacy in the past by restricting energy flows to Eastern Europe. Problematically for the West, Adam Wittenhall from The Independent explains that because oil pipelines to the West run through Eastern Europe as well, their supply is also shut off. The Stratfor Center impacts that this allows Russia to leverage its energy supplies as a political bargaining chip to make the West do what it wants. However, a European Parliament report outlines that current political tensions have forced the European Union to secure alternatives to Russian aggression and Russian gas. Thus, we affirm.
Everybody gets a little Okay. So your second contention is about energy independence.
Yeah.
So how much of a decrease in European dependence on Russian oil have you seen?
I mean, it's a trend.
Give me like
Okay, so in October, Poland started supplying oil that it would have bought with Russia with Saudi Arabian oil, and just last week, America started supplying oil to Russia for the
So wait, either way, they're dependent on the country, right? Being dependent on Saudi Arabia not worse than being dependent on Russia?
I mean, it's not topical. The topic asks, is the Russian threat reducing? And even if maybe a Saudi Arabian threat is increasing, it's still an affirmative ballot. Can I take a question? Okay, your first contention, you talk about human rights abuses. Why is that topical to Western interests?
We give you the reason in our first impact, right? We tell you that human rights are obviously a massive Western interest.
Okay, so
every single foreign policy.
If there's such a big foreign policy initiative and there's such an interest in the West, when has the West invaded simply to save lives?
I mean, I would say that invasion is probably something the U.S. doesn't want to do.
When is that been the
It's important to understand that just because I don't take action on an interest does not mean it's not an interest, right?
I mean, clearly it does. Yeah, if you're not taking action on an interest, then it's not that big of an interest,
well,
right?
No. Obviously it's totally different, right? Would you argue, you would say that genocide, preventing genocide is probably Western interest, right?
I mean, when have we stepped in simply to prevent a genocide?
Right, the thing is we have it, but that doesn't mean it's
Okay.
not an interest.
I mean, it does, yeah.
So we don't care about genocides that go on in Africa as Western
I mean,
interest?
sadly, it's not a Western interest, right?
okay, wait, like ultimately then, like why do all the foreign policy doctrines of those countries discuss how they need to uphold human rights in order to have any sort of semblance or credence of actually upholding
all that talk,
legitimacy?
all that talk
Even,
is great,
hold
but
on,
like
really
in
quickly.
reality, that's not how our foreign policy
Really quickly,
works.
even if like they're not the best at taking action over it, the West still has to uphold it as an interest, because if they don't say that human rights are so important, they don't talk about things like democracy as being important,
but they have to.
then their international legitimacy is undermined.
They have to, but they never have. Go ahead.
That doesn't mean it's not an interest. Okay.
Yes, it does.
So quickly on your first contention about internal strife, right?
Sure.
So how is Putin like reverting back to domestic policy like you discussed?
Okay, so what we're telling you is that the Stratfor evidence specifically outlines that $5.2 billion has been set aside in the public budget to actually like control the West, to kind of tamp it down.
What does that mean, control the West?
So like what you say, like there's like increasing protests against the sanctions, things like that. So Putin now has to, so Putin now has to focus more of his capital and more of his like abilities in.
Just because he puts aside a certain amount, like 5 billion, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean he doesn't like still engage more aggressively abroad, right?
I mean, it's limited capital, right? Like $5 billion spent in.
I don't think that like one of the largest economies in the world is like limited.
It is limited. Like if you spend $5 billion in an area, then that means you can't spend $5 billion. That
countries go into debt.
Sure.
Okay, cool. So then, like, what's like the prevention?
The impact is that Russia is now going to have to care more about its internal divisions that are happening right now. That's like splitting.
Can they like justify those divisions and say like don't look at like what's going on in your poverty? Like,
I mean, I'm sure they're trying to justify the divisions, but on the.
Middle age is down. Make sure you're louder than the people behind us. I have a hard time with that.
Starting off on a general overview of today's debate, I recognize we should be looking to Ukraine first, because as what we tell you from Alexander Nobles's Foreign Affairs, Ukraine is the critical Western interest in that region. Because if we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, one, we lose the crucial buffer state that is Ukraine. We see Russia right on our border. But furthermore, Ukraine is crucial to upholding NATO hegemony and legitimacy. If we can't stop Russia in Ukraine, that shows that NATO is a weak actor and an effective actor that undermines nuclear proliferation needs, that undermines our whole objective goal of projecting a strong West. With that being said, the two opponents' arguments. So first they talk about how the Russian defense industry is hurt, and they tell you this is happening first they tell you that it's weak, but this is empirically not true. What the Brookings Institute tells you isn't to look at the Russian defense industry like a NBA players on a roster and say this player is great, this player is old. Instead, you look to how they actually do on the court. When you look to Russia's abilities on the ground, they prove to be one of the most modern militaries in the world. What the Daily Beast tells you is the United States was shocked by the modernness of the Russian military in Syria. Don't buy my opponent's false narrative here. But furthermore, recognize that sanctions have not deterred the Russian military at all. He cites a diplomat who tells you they're decreasing their spending by 1.8%, but sanctions didn't affect that. In fact, that was always the plan from December 2014. Russia didn't change it because of sanctions. Instead, they're continuing the military modernization plan. Furthermore, they talk about troops on the ground, but recognize those are only increasing, according to Adam Nathan of The Independent, and this is furthered by the Washington Post, who's telling you that Russia is pouring in heavy ammunition and weapons into Ukraine. Recognize Russia's military isn't restricted at all, it's just growing. Secondly, on their subpoint B, they talk about internal strife. 1. Recognize the Russian GDP was not hurt by sanctions. What trading economics tells you is that oil was the main factor that caused the collapse, because when sanctions were imposed, the Russian GDP actually continued to grow. The Russian GDP never stopped growing until the oil prices fell. Furthermore, what the University of Moscow tells you is the majority of Russia is reliant on a shadow economy, on illegal imports. Therefore, the citizens aren't hurt by that because they were getting it from the illegal black market anyways. Instead, all these harms because of oil, you even call their impact. So you don't get, and then furthermore, on this idea of unrest, this is simply untrue. Deutsche Welle tells you that Putin's party won every single election unanimously in October, and the approval rating is at all-time high. We're not seeing any of this unrest. Don't give them the impact of being more aggressive. Furthermore, they say 94% of the time sanctions change target state behavior here, but Russia is at 6% because it's such a unique autocratic actor. Then on the third one, they talk about how we're deterring Russia and Ukraine. This is not true. One, we see, according to the New York Post, that Russia has seized 250 more square miles of land. They're just going further. In Mariupol, in April, they went in and took Mariupol there. We didn't stop the invasion. Overall, you can also look at this idea we tell you in case of subversive warfare. Russia, according to the Atlantic Council, completely controls all of Ukrainian telecommunications, and that's why at the end of the day, we're seeing them be more aggressive here. Then on their second mention, they talk about oil and gas development. So while it might be nice that the United States and Western countries try to wean themselves off Russian oil and natural gas, it simply isn't happening. What Investopedia tells you is that Russian gas is so crucial to the West, we didn't put sanctions on Russian gas trade, or we also haven't stopped trading with them in terms of technology. ExxonMobil has still been signing deals with Russia during sanctions. We're not seeing the harm here. That's why empirically, furthermore, they talk about this idea how we can just turn to Saudi Arabia, we can turn to the US, but Sputnik News tells you this isn't true because they aren't profitable markets for the West. It's much more the best for them to get their money from Russia because it's the cheapest for them. That's why you don't grant them any of their impacts. In fact, we can turn them straight against them because what we're seeing is even they try to set this deal when they try to wean themselves away from Russian oil. But recognize Investopedia tells you that failed, and in December of 2015, they started another oil trade pipeline with Russia because they depend so much on Russian oil. At the end of the day, our addiction to Russian oil, the West's addiction to Russian oil is too high. Sanctions have not prevented that from stopping, and they're actually growing. Projections say they're going to increase by 20%. So if war independence is so important, as my opponents are telling you, that's just increasing. Sanctions have not proved that threat for all those reasons you should believe.
Can I say what part? New York Post, they see Mariupol.
Yeah.
Is everyone ready? Okay. So starting off with the overview, he reads where he says Ukraine is the most critical interest. While we agree Ukraine is definitely of critical interest for the West, you're going to be preferring that because they specifically tell you it's important because it's upholding NATO hegemony. If we show you overall that NATO hegemony is increasing in general when we have sanctions in a long-term way, first you're going to be preferring long-term impacts insofar as Ukraine has been going up and down for a while, but second of all, you're going to be preferring structural impacts, more overall ways where we can actually prove that Russia's long-term leverage is being decreased. With that, let's go into their first contention about human rights, and there are going to be a number of problems with this. The first problem is that it's overall non-union. McFowle of Stanford explains that Russia's repressive actions predate sanctions. They just give you a general analysis of how much repression should occur by, but then they just tell you that Russia is like doing things that are repressive. They don't actually give you the comparative analysis taking place in Russia on the ground. Russia is always going to be a repressive government. It was doing so before sanctions, and it will continue to do so. But then second, you can actually turn this argument. Because of our own first contention, we show that because of political dissidence, Russia is being forced to turn inward. That's the Stratford evidence. Everything they're talking about is the warrant for one of the warrants for our first contention, where we actually show that because Russia is being forced to suppress its own people, they're spending $5.2 billion on focusing inward. They're not going to be able to be economic or to be foreign aggressive. Then the third problem with this is that when they talk about in their first impact how it's a Western interest, recognize that it's not necessarily inherently a Western interest for a government to preserve its human rights. Unfortunately, the West barely ever intervenes just in the name of human rights. Also, we have a ton of allies who are autocratic regimes, like Saudi Arabia, like a lot of Middle Eastern countries. So just because of the way a regime governs, it doesn't actually have necessarily any bearing on whether or not it's going to be helpful or harmful to the West. Then in their second impact, they talk about Peterson and his 279% increase in conflict. First problem is that, like, this conflict they're talking about isn't going to materialize. Russia is never going to attack the West. But the second, McCormick of UPenn actually explains that Russia isn't going to be able to have any sort of military capabilities abroad in the long term because of the structural harms to their military that are occurring as a result of sanctions. But then third, this is reverse causal. Obviously, if there's conflict happening in an area, we're also more likely to inflict sanctions on that area. Next, moving to their second contention about Hawken to bear. The first one they give you is about how these Siloviki are being pushed in. But the first problem is that Newsweek explains that Putin just replaced an advisor who was more militarily aggressive with somebody who's going to be actually negotiating a peace deal, signaling a move from an active military phase to a more diplomatic phase. But then the second problem comes from Name of the Atlantic, who explains that Putin's rhetoric is actually softening. Second, they talk about how backing into a corner and how it gives him an alibi, but Matthews and Newsweek explains that actually Russia's support is decreasing in the status quo. As the Stratford Remember explains that they're being forced to turn inward to dispel this local dissidence, and currently only 38% of Russians agree that we should have some sort of military presence, that they should have some sort of military presence abroad, since they're seeing the actual cost to their standard of living in the status quo. Next, when they talk about how he can't de-escalate, remember McCormick, who says even if he thinks he can't de-escalate, he's going to be forced to in the long term, insofar as his military is physically unable to sustain it. But then go into their impacts. First, they talk about decrease in democratization. But first, the Washington Times explains that Russia just this week has signaled that it is willing to trade eastern Ukraine for economic relief. We're seeing them being brought to the table in a way that never would have occurred in the absence of sanctions. Because in the absence of sanctions, there's absolutely no cost to Putin's actions. There's nothing stopping him from continuing what he's doing. But then second, Korea explains that two regions voted to secede from Ukraine and become part of Russia, and Russia rejected them. That's something that also never would have happened before sanctions. Then on their second impact, the first problem is that actually Secretary of the Polish Studies Institute explains that overall sanctions have bought time for Ukraine to be strengthened, which means that overall they're not going to be able to destabilize them in the long term. But then second, Secretary also explains that humanitarian, economic, and military aid has been increased from the West to Russia, even if we've given sanctions. So we're showing that overall we're strengthening Ukraine's ability to defend itself against these covert types of Russian insurgency they're talking about. Yeah, so in our second contention, we talk about how when NATO and the EU become less dependent on Russian oil, then they're able to not have this like Russian influence.
So like if you win the argument that they become less dependent, that's the only way you're proving to me that they increase their hegemony, right?
I mean, that's one way, but also insofar as like they're decreasing Russia's ability to like project militarily in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe in general. That's also a big harm.
You can ask me a question.
Okay, so you said that like according to Deutschwell, Putin's support is really good because his party won all of the recent elections. Do you think those were necessarily legitimate elections?
Well, like insofar as there's no shift in the tide, right? Like
Wait, how is there no shift in the tide?
like if he's still winning every election uncontested, nothing is going to change in
Right.
Russia.
I mean, okay, so if he's winning every election uncontested, how do we know that those elections are 100% an accurate representation of what the
I'm not saying that they are an accurate representation. All I'm saying is that they show
Are
you. All I'm saying is that they show you that there's no change in Russia. Like Putin isn't incentivized to do any action insofar as he he's seeing everything go his way, he doesn't
No,
need to like focus
I mean,
domestic.
if he's like rigging elections to make it look like people are voting for
But
him,
he's always been rigging
obviously he's like
elections.
getting scared.
No, he's
Yeah,
always
yeah.
rigging
I'm not
elections.
saying that's a change. I'm just saying like what
Like-
you're saying about how Putin support is really good
Like
because
until you
he's
can
staying in
prove to
power.
me how sanctions solve for like the institutional corruption in the Russian government, then there's
Sanctions
no.
don't have to do that to reduce the threat that Russia poses to the West.
But they do have to do that for Putin to care about what's happening to his citizens. Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Okay, so when you talk about Russia de-escalating in Ukraine, right? Like, if their goal is now to destabilize the region versus taking land in the region, shouldn't we be looking to how effective they are at destabilizing?
Okay, well, we would say two things to that. First of all, recognize that insofar as they're like signing a long-term peace deal, that's like obviously even if they're pulling out troops, we're still seeing some sort of diplomatic progress. But then second, sanctions have bought time for Ukraine to become more stable and elect new leaders.
That's really
Wait, can I ask you a question?
Really quickly. Like, how does sanctions buy time for like Ukraine to like if Russia controls all of its electronics and like media communication, how does like sanctions buy time for them to fix that problem?
Okay, because sanctions like give Ukraine a breathing room insofar as like even in the
They
short
can't
term
replace
Russia
all the
would look.
infrastructure.
Okay, first you have to prove that Russia would be able to like control all of Ukraine's like communications
That's what the
indefinitely.
Atlantic Council tells you.
Just because they can control like their communications doesn't mean that they have like political control insofar as most of Ukraine is still like sovereign. Could I take a
Yeah, you
question?
had a question, yeah.
Okay, so you said that Russia always planned to reduce its military. So when were sanctions put in place?
No, in December of
Wait,
2014.
just when were sanctions?
I'm not saying they always planned to. They March 2014.
Okay,
Right?
so if they plan to cut as of December 2014, why would that not be a result?
It was not a plan to cut, right? It was a budget plan they always
Yeah,
implemented.
a budget plan that they made in December 2014.
But insofar as you lose your link to the economy, it doesn't really matter.
We'll take credit.
Well, yeah, it's just Excel. It should be there, I'm sure there are frameworks that I just, because of myself, but it was written that make the final focus in the middle, and that way, you know, hopefully it gets them down. That's what the debate goes on. Yeah, exactly. And I've been pulling out a computer for decades, before I guarantee. It's a matter of fact, computers don't go very long. I was really worried this tournament because I didn't know electrical outlet, and then I moved over and
Right.
call or whatever we needed.
Y'all need off, I heard that.
As long as you're clear, probably not, but if you want to, sure.
I'm just gonna tell you, I'm just gonna start with the framing at the top of the rebuttals, and then I'll just ask what's from there. Sound good, everyone? Okay, cool. Starting on framing, they agree that Ukraine is the most important Western interest, but then she also tells you that we look to the long-term issue here. But don't look to that. What's more important is the destabilization that's going on in the short term. If me and Marvin prove to that sanctions specifically make Russia destabilize Ukraine as an entire state as a whole, that means that the short-term impacts of destabilization outweigh anything that goes on in the long term, because if they destabilize the entire Ukrainian situation right now, what we tell you from foreign affairs is that destabilizes the rest of Eastern Europe and also undermines NATO legitimacy. Look to the short term first, look to destabilization. But then on their case, first, on their first contention, they talk about the idea of decreasing military spending. Remember, they say that there's a decrease in military spending right now on March 6th of the budget. But the diplomat tells you is that's because they're decreasing right now, and then next year they're going to increase the military budget again by 4%. So obviously in the long term they're not seeing any sort of impact. But then next on internal strike, remember Amar tells you they're not actually being hurt by sanctions, they're being hurt by oil, there's no link to the economy. And then finally remember that the people themselves are resilient on a shadow economy, they're not being hurt, they're not protesting, which is why Putin's party won all elections in a landslide. And then finally on energy politics, at the bottom of their case, remember, we're telling you specifically that ExxonMobil is still signing deals, and just in December of 2015, they signed another deal with Russia, the East, and another deal with Russia, they're becoming more dependent. Amar tells you there's a 20% increase in dependence in the long term. Then, go back to our case. Our second contention on increasing Russian aggression on the Slovak specifically. group their two responses and talk about how like Putin's shifting away with his rhetoric. The important thing to understand here is the Washington Times tells you that as Putin's rhetoric says that like we're going to concede and we're going to sign a deal, all he's doing is he's shifting more and more towards destabilization. His actions don't match his words. Remember, we're telling you specifically that they don't respond to the fact that sanctions are pushing out the economic advisors. They say that like one new guy has come in, but that's not important enough to reveal the fact that on balance the Siloviki wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for sanctions. Remember, ultimately, the thing that we tell you at the bottom of our cases from Kozak, they tell you that Ukraine was able to buy time because of the ceasefires. We're telling you specifically that the ceasefire deals don't buy them time to actually prevent these sort of subversive terrorist attacks that are actually going on, because Kozak ultimately concludes that there's going to be destabilization of the Ukrainian state as a whole, specifically because they're going behind the scenes that only happens in a world of sanctions.
Laura,
So it's going to go, framing their case, and then it's going to start at the bottom of my case and go with what?
Framing?
Yeah, framing, the offense they extend, and then bottom of my case.
Their case.
Yeah. Alright. Is everyone ready? First on framing, they try and tell you that long term is bad, but they never tell you why, right? All they say is that destabilization is overall in the short term, but why? Remember what Ella tells you, sanctions are a macro effect, right? Like there's ebb and flow, but you have to look at the overall trend. At that point, you're buying our long term effects over their short term, like punitive measures. First, let's go into the offense they extend, which is first destabilization. Now again, you're looking to the long term. First off, Ella gives you Washington Post, who says that Russia is willing to capitulate to both territories that was ceded back. That's a really clear place to affirm, because that means that overall Putin is becoming more and more pacified because of these sanctions. Remember, in absentia of sanctions, there's literally nothing to check Putin. But again, remember Guria, who says that the two areas of Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk, who actually voted to secede from Ukraine, Russia said no and did not let them in. That's a change of character for Russia. That's a really clear way to affirm. But then next, on the Siloviki coming in, remember what Ella tells you. Just a couple days ago, Russia kicked out one of the biggest anti-Western members and brought in a peace deal. That's overall trend happening right there. Now go on to my case, first off of energy politics. Now all of their responses are like punitive measures, right? They signed oil pipeline in 2015 and Saudi Arabia has expensive oil, right? That's ultimately non-responsive to the long term. You're extending Overland and you're extending the CRS, who basically tells you that Europe will need more oil and Russia will not physically be able to supply that oil because of the supply chains that are going to be shut down because of these sanctions, right? A 7% decrease in oil, and Europe is going to have to look elsewhere. That's decreasing the threat. That's not just decreasing the threat, that's eliminating the threat Russia can pose. Now next, let's talk about verbiage. Now this is really key here because they're trying to tell you they're trying to tell you that it's because of oil and not necessarily because of the sanctions. Remember Garbage, who tells you that oil loans in the status quo are being denied because of sanctions, right? It all leads back to sanctions. If you want to believe that the Russian economy is faltering, it ultimately leads back to sanctions, which is really important for military might. Now they're trying to tell you these like punitive measures, like troops are coming on the border. If you extend Bodner, who tells you $775 million in the economy is going to be cut right now, and Standish, who tells you long-term development is not possible without Western cooperation, that makes Russia more pacified. That's a reason to affirm.
Everyone good?
yes.
So let's talk about this two countries seceding thing. So like, why did Putin decline to like offer?
Sanctions.
How?
fearing like a bigger reaction because of sanctions.
What does that mean? What bigger reaction does that mean?
Harsher sanctions?
Okay, like, so like right now, right, like every single foreign policy official, like John Kerry, like the EU are saying they're about to like alleviate sanctions, right? So why would he fear more sanctions?
Well, this was like in like early 2015.
Right, so like early 2015, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so what?
So you're looking to Russia's actions today instead of looking to them in early 2015?
I mean, I think we should look at the entire span of sanctions.
Right, like
Sure,
what
but
we're
rather we should ask
Okay,
us to look at our reducing. We should be looking to what's happening.
Okay, well,
So
here's-
what,
Thing.
insofar as what's happening right now, you're just saying he's like getting new advisors, right?
Well, we say he's already gotten the new advisors,
Okay.
how to be more
Sure,
expressive.
so like how many of these like CLVP have been brought into the
I
government?
mean, ultimately, what we take from Ankara is those Siloviki are stronger than they have ever been, specifically because of
Okay, so is it like two and they're really strong, or is it like
I mean, like
four?
his inner circle is dominated by them.
Well, like, if you want
The specific number isn't as important as the fact that his ideology is now dominantly anti-Western when before
And
it
what
was
are the
back.
specific ways that those are manifesting in terms of policy?
We tell you that the specific way they do it is turn to the more dangerous form of subversive warfare.
like what does that mean?
Okay.
You guys read a lot of stuff talking about how, like, on the ground, like, Putin is, like, about to get back territory, like,
Yeah.
he's signing deals, right? What we're telling you specifically from the Washington Times in my summary, which you don't respond to, is Putin is spewing all that rhetoric to make the West seem like he's cooperating, but in reality, he's just gonna turn around and create more
Well, then
destabilization.
if he did that, then why wouldn't the West just like turn around and then put the sanctions back on him?
I mean, like, you have to prove that that would occur,
I
right?
mean,
Like,
but the reason why sanctions are there in the first place,
Well,
right,
like-
is because we're scared
But
of
like,
like
even
Russian
if they do that, our whole point of the argument is they can put as many sanctions on Putin as he wants, insofar as he controls the airwaves, the phone lines, can send his
So what
terrorists.
does that mean, he controls the phone lines? So he just like listen to Ukrainian people's calls?
he has, like,
or what?
telecommunications control.
Okay, but what does that
He,
mean?
like,
Yeah.
owns, like, Russian governments, like,
Like,
supply
if you want,
and occupy
if you want me to
those
give you
kinds
an
of
example of like how that's a threat, like you would look
Yeah.
to like a cyber attack that was conducted 2 weeks ago that cut off Ukrainian
Does
power
Russia
in the
need to
middle
have
of the
like, does Russia need to have like control of the phone lines to have like cyber attacks on?
I'm saying phone line, I think they control everything in Ukraine. They
They
control
control
Ukrainian.
everything in Ukraine, like in
They
the
can-
entire country?
Like, you would be like, yeah, it's like very surprising, but the thing is that ultimately,
How-
because of Russia, like Putin's actions, he has taken occupation of those industries.
How are they sustaining, like, if they're just controlling every single industry in Ukraine, that makes no sense.
Like, it's not like
It's not
every
every
single
industry.
industry.
I
It's not
think-
exactly the most like developed country in the world.
It's like Russia controls the telecommunications network.
Okay, so
Russia
you,
can hack it.
you just said it's all, like,
Yeah.
all infrastructure, but then
I
the
think
only
Ozan
one you read is
misspoke. I think Ozan
telecommunications?
misspoke. I think Ozan misspoke. What we're talking about here is telecommunication.
Oh, so wait,
gas
so
grid.
what? Like, so what if Russia controls it?
Like, ultimately, we're telling you that that's going to the destabilization in the short term that outweighs any
So
sort
they
of
control
possibility
the
of
phone
long-term
lines, so
impacts.
Ukraine is going to collapse.
We'll take it a short breath.
Let's clear our framework at the top. Remember, our opponents are telling you to look to the ebb and flow of sanctions. What we're telling you is the destabilization of Ukraine is an irreversible impact, which, if it occurs, undermines all of NATO hegemony. If it occurs, leads to the loss of a buffer state. That's why it's so crucial in today's debate. If we can show you Ukraine is being destabilized, you clearly vote for the con. A couple of things here. First, recognize the only arguments my opponents go for in their summary is this idea of like econ, Ukraine, and oil. Don't let them go for anything else in the second final focus. That's unfair to us as the first speaker team. Insofar as that's true, let's start with this argument on oil and how they're leading off Russian oil. They're completely unresponsive to what we tell you, that it isn't economically fruitful. We actually turn the argument, we're showing you that there's going to be a 20% increase in dependence on Russian oil. They're signing new deals. At the end of the day, this isn't materializing for our opponents. Sanctions have failed to reduce the threat. In fact, the threat is increasing because they're becoming more dependent. The second place we vote for us is on this idea of military. One, we show you the Russian military is extremely strong, one of the most modern in the world. They never respond to to that. Insofar as sanctions have not deterred their capabilities on the ground today, Joe Biden went to the analysis saying like a 0.8% spending decrease is going to cause all these harms because clearly it isn't. They're sending in more heavy ammunition, they're sending in more troops, the threat is increasing. Finally, on Ukraine, we're waiting this for a couple of reasons. So she tries to misconstrue this argument in Crossfire saying, well, it's only a couple of phone lines, right? But recognize what we're telling you is it controls the gas industry. It controls the telecommunications network in Ukraine. This is really important because when Russia causes a cyber attack that causes power outage, putting Ukrainian citizens out of power for the middle of winter, that causes destabilization. You look to Igor Kozak, who tells you specifically that sanctions, because they push in the Siloviki, who are stronger than ever and enough to influence Putin's actions, we're seeing him put in the insurgent agents. They're literally completely unresponsive to Kozak because in December of 2015, the most recent evidence in today's debate, they're successfully destabilizing the Ukraine. Insofar as that's true, we're clearly showing you that regardless of what's happening within troops, regardless of what Putin's saying, we're seeing the destabilization occurring, we're seeing the undermining occurring, and we're losing the crucial buffer state. You vote for the negative.
Alright, we'll take the last 20 seconds. Is everyone ready? First on framing, basically